Of the many scenes from September 11th, 2001 that have been etched into the public consciousness, few are as iconic as the images of the survivors and first responders escaping Ground Zero, completely covered in dust from the destruction of the Twin Towers.
Ghost University, the tyranny of experts, lying deceivers. All right. This will be the story of Cate Jenkins. She used to work for the Environmental Protection Agency known as the EPA. That's a government agency, and they, of course, tell us about the environment and whether things are safe or unsafe and the things that are happening in our environment. That's a short story. And while she was working for the EPA, she did work against Monsanto. I don't know how many people on my channel are familiar with Monsanto, but Monsanto has been sued numerous times in the past, 25, 30 years or so, over their handling of their products and what they do to the environment. And Cate Jenkins went against Monsanto and has made us all aware that Monsanto isn't exactly the best to trust when it comes to taking care of the environment. And so after 9/11, Cate Jenkins said that after the towers fell, the air around the Twin Towers wasn't safe for people to breathe. And that's important because the first responders, and let alone the people who live there, and I'm sure some of the first responders live around there, were inhaling all of the smoke / dust / whatever's in the dust and the smoke around 9/11 as they try to clean it up and perform rescue efforts. Now, she said it was unsafe, and our own government, the White House at the time, I believe it was the Bush White House, said that no, it is safe, and everybody should go out and behave as normal. But after a few, they were comparing the work of Cate Jenkins with the work that the government said, and the government had actually lied on Cate Jenkins and changed her paperwork. They nullified her paperwork and changed it into things that she wasn't quite saying, basically saying the air was safe. She was saying it wasn't. They had subtle ways of saying it's not safe. But either way, the air around the Twin Towers was not safe. And they eventually fired Cate Jenkins and eventually brought her back. And in my work about the articles that I did about the tyranny of experts, I showed that there are some people who believe when experts are caught being wrong, they just say, well, we used the best knowledge we had at the time. And there's a lady named Christine Todd Whitman who says exactly that. She says we had used the best knowledge of the time to talk about whether the air around the Twin Towers was safe or not. And so this long clip, 24 minutes long, will go off into what Cate Jenkins said against the government and the work that she did. And this is what I mean when I talk about the tyranny of experts. And I could be a conspiracy theorist for saying that, the government doesn't have our best interests at heart, and they lie to us, and they understand when they're lying. And this video will directly show that at times they definitely will lie, which means they don't have your best interests at heart. I'll go over some ideas about why perhaps they lie, and then other times might tell you the truth as we go through this video about Cate Jenkins.
And of the many, many lies told by government officials in the days following the attacks, few have been as blatant or as clearly documented as the lies about the safety of that dust propounded by the EPA and its administrator at the time, Christine Todd Whitman.
Asbestos was in there, is in those buildings, lead is in those buildings. There are the VOCs. However, the concentrations are such that they don't pose a health hazard.
So here we are with her saying that the concentrations of asbestos and whatever other elements or things that can be toxic to a human aren't in levels that can harm you. But we'll see as the video goes on that they were indeed harmful to people. And if you guys just go look it up, people still nowadays are being infected with all types of cancers and other ailments thanks to the dust that they inhaled around the World Trade Center. The tyranny of experts and lying deceivers and secrets is indeed real.
Well, if there's any good news out of all this, it's that everything we've tested for, which includes asbestos, lead, and VOCs, have been below any level of concern for the general public health. Obviously, for those who are down here, these are very important. Statements that EPA officials made after 9/11 were based on the judgment of experienced environmental and health professionals at EPA, OSHA, and the CDC, who had analyzed the test data that 13 different organizations and agencies were collecting in Lower Manhattan. I do not recall any EPA scientist or experts responsible for reviewing this data ever advising me that the test data from Lower Manhattan showed that the air or water proposed long-term health risks for the general public.
Well, Ms. Whitman, it doesn't matter what they advise you of. If most of the people who you are in contact with are on the same payroll that you are, because none of them, if advised by the White House or whoever is in control of the narrative, advises you to tell people that the air is safe. And that's the problem. It doesn't matter what agency comes out and says it's safe, if all you guys are in on the lie together. And this is why I say these people lie. Now, how do we know who to trust? You have to be vigilant. And we're going to have to make sure that every ounce, if we can help it, of information is vetted, or the people that we really listen to give us these answers to whether the environment is safe for us or not is vetted thoroughly, so we can understand what the truth is. Because if not, they're going to lie to us, and who knows where those lies will ultimately lead your life, and it might lead your life into the grave. But anyway.
As we now know, these statements were all lies. As early as September 18th, the very same day that Whitman was assuring New Yorkers that the air was safe to breathe, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, had already detected sulfur dioxide levels in the air so high that, according to one industrial hygienist, they exceeded the EPA's standard for a classification of hazardous. And even in those early days, first responders were already reporting a range of health problems, including coughing, wheezing, eye irritation, and headaches.
When I think about the levels of toxicity in the air around the Twin Towers, I just simply like to go back to, or think about what and how much air does it take in a house that's on fire if you're in there? Like, how much smoke does it take to choke you out? And how toxic does it become before your lungs can't handle it anymore? And these people were breathing in a whole lot of dust or smoke, and God knows what's in it. From the cars that exploded to the debris from the Twin Towers coming down to Earth and blowing everywhere. Things are blowing everywhere. Who knows what's in there? But yet they told them it's safe. I just can't buy it. And I'm sure neither were they. Because after days or hours of being there, they were coughing and choking and talking about the discomfort that they were feeling. But after weeks and months of being there, it's supposed to go away, or their concerns about how their body's feeling aren't real. I'm sure they were being contaminated by God knows what. But let's continue.
Even so, Whitman and the EPA persisted in perpetuating the lies about the dust, assuring New Yorkers that respirators were not needed outside of the restricted area around Ground Zero. And, as we examined in 9/11 suspects Christine Todd Whitman, it was later confirmed that the White House had been editing the EPA's press releases on the air quality in Manhattan and removing warnings about the air safety all along.
In the wake of 9/11, there were serious concerns about whether the air around Ground Zero was filled with toxins, unsafe for workers and residents. But by September 18th, many New Yorkers were back in their apartments and on the job, partly because of this press release that day from the Environmental Protection Agency, reassuring New Yorkers that their air is safe to breathe. Was that press release misleading?
It was surely not telling all of the truth.
In an exclusive interview, Inspector General Nikki Tinsley, the EPA's top watchdog, tells NBC News the agency simply did not have sufficient data to justify such a reassurance. In fact, a new report by Tinsley's office says at the time, more than 25% of dust samples collected before September 18th showed unsafe levels of asbestos, and the EPA had no test results at all on PCBs, dioxins, or particulates in the air that can cause respiratory problems.
The EPA did not give the people of New York complete information.
So what happened? Tinsley's report charges in the crucial days after 9/11, the White House changed EPA press releases to add reassuring statements and delete cautionary ones. September 13th, the EPA draft release, never released to the public, says EPA testing terrorized sites for environmental hazards.
In Genesis, we find out that the lies of the devil are very subtle, and we have to be careful in the wording of the things that we read and make sure we understand the context that they're being put in, because they're very subtle with their lies, including the lies that come from the White House.
The White House changes that to EPA reassures public about environmental hazards. September 16th, the EPA draft says recent samples of dust on Water Street show higher levels of asbestos. The White House version, new samples confirm ambient air quality meets OSHA standards and is not a cause for public concern. And the White House leaves out entirely this warning, that air samples raise concerns for cleanup workers and office workers near Water Street.
What many do not know, because their story has been largely ignored and marginalized, is that there were officials within the EPA who were desperately trying to blow the whistle on the agency's lies. Officials like Cate Jenkins. Dr. Cate Jenkins had joined the EPA in December 1979, serving as an environmental scientist with EPA's Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. Her work included detecting hazardous waste and developing regulations for their control, a role that took on special importance in the wake of the toxic dust clouds covering Manhattan on 9/11. Unlike many of the other 9/11 whistleblowers, however, the events of September 11, 2001 did not represent the first time Dr. Jenkins had to blow the whistle on her own agency. Jenkins dealt with many hazardous waste products in her job, but she specialized in dioxin, aka Agent Orange, a contaminant of wood preservatives that was used in the Vietnam War as a defoliant. Monsanto Chemical Corporation was the largest producer of Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, and it was a series of Monsanto-sponsored studies in the early 1980s that led the EPA to conclude that human evidence supporting an association between dioxin and cancer is considered inadequate. In February 1990, Jenkins wrote a memo to the EPA Science Advisory Board alleging that the Monsanto-sponsored studies were fraudulent, and that the studies, if performed correctly, would have shown the carcinogenic.
Monsanto is a company that has been heavy in making sure that they are the leaders in genetically modified organisms. And that includes things that they can splice into our food to make our food unsafe for us. And what I really mean by unsafe is that they haven't had enough time to experiment on the food that they make, or the splicing in of modified genes that they place into the food, or modifying the DNA of food to the point where the food is unsafe for people. And some people know about this, other people don't. And another thing Monsanto does, and our government does, is our government allows for people who work at Monsanto, who have agendas, to come into the government and then lobby our government, or work in our Congress, or work in agriculture, or work in whatever field they need to further the plans of Monsanto, and then go back and work for Monsanto. And this has been big for years. So you work for the government, then you go back and work for Monsanto. And then you work for Monsanto, then you go back and work for the government. And you flip-flop back and forth for as long as you can, until somebody says, okay, that's enough. or they find somebody to replace you. That's been going on for a very long time. Just look up perhaps the idea that Monsanto and our government should be a conflict of interest. Google that. And I have a video where I'll show eventually what the relationship is between our government and Monsanto. But for sure, Monsanto doesn't have the best interest of farmers or the people who buy products from the farmers' best interest at heart at all.
The memo caught the attention of the press and, under the glare of a media spotlight, the EPA launched a criminal investigation of Monsanto. That investigation was opened on August 20th and closed less than 2 years later. But, as EPA whistleblower William Sanger notes, the investigation itself and the basis for closing the investigation were fraudulent.
Fraudulent meaning he didn't see a reason to close the investigation into the antics of Monsanto. I've showed people who watch my channel the Leipzig Connection book that goes into how you create a cover-up. You form organizations and let me start over. If I have an organization of myself and I have 5 people who I believe work for me but can give out information that toes the line that I want to be told, I'm going to send them out and give those people positions in government or higher education or at colleges, working for the government, whatever it may be, so I can continue to disseminate information in the way I see fit. And that's what happened. They stopped the investigation because there are too many people who work for Monsanto that wanted to see Monsanto get over. And that guy said, working for the EPA, why don't we stop investigating? He was like, this is terrible. But this happens all the time. And that's why I'm making this series about the tyranny of experts, so we can see the flawed logic and flawed alleged scientific evidence that experts give.
No attempt was even made to determine the scientific validity of the studies in question, and the EPA declined to pursue the matter because of statute of limitations technicalities. The EPA did, however, find time to mount a campaign of retribution against Jenkins for having the audacity to blow the whistle on the agency and its listing practices for hazardous chemicals. Her workload was reduced, and higher-ups at the EPA immediately began talking about shunting her off into a purely administrative position where she would not be involved with anything that puts her in direct contact with the regulated community or the public. Her supervisor even wrote a letter to Monsanto apologizing for Jenkins' memo questioning their studies.
As a society, we should be aware of what the FDA and the EPA and whatever other government agency wants to label an ingredient as whatever they say it is, right? This is what I mean. Allegedly, ice cream has antifreeze in it, but they don't tell you it's antifreeze. They relabel it as something different. It's just the same as when you see natural and artificial flavors, okay? Natural can be bugs, where bugs are used to flavor your food. We need to know the definitions of things that our government uses to disseminate information to the rest of us. We have to know. We need law books. We need the dictionaries that the FDA uses, the Food and Drug Administration uses to tell us what food is. Short story. There's a gentleman who sued Taco Bell. And he sued Taco Bell because he said Taco Bell doesn't use 100% beef in their tacos. Well, here's the problem. When most restaurants say, especially the fast food restaurants, say they use 100% beef, they mean they use 33%. So when they say 100% beef, they mean 33% of the beef product that we eat is actually beef. The rest of it is something else. You guys should go look it up. Beef isn't beef. Unless you're cooking it yourself. And you killed the cow and got the beef together and cooked it yourself. Or you went to an organic farm where the farmer says, hey, these are my cows and you are welcome to purchase one and I'll chop the cow up and give you everything that is edible from the cow. But we need to know, what exactly are we eating and how it affects us?
Jenkins filed a complaint with the Department of Labor, and in a series of cases that were appealed all the way up to the Secretary of Labor himself, it was found that she had been unfairly retaliated against for her whistleblowing, and the EPA was ordered to reinstate her in her previous position. But as nightmarish as that years-long, potentially career-ending ordeal in whistleblowing was for Dr. Jenkins, it was nothing compared to the ordeal she would have to face after the day that changed everything.
I thought it was the third plane though. No.
Even as a layperson who looks at all of that smoke or dust that's in the air and can even come close to saying that that is healthy for people to breathe in, I just don't get it. You know, when you're in a house and a house is on fire, it doesn't take much for smoke to overtake you. And I don't know if that cloud that's in the air at the World Trade Center is smoke or dust, but I'm sure it's not healthy for people to breathe in. You can look at it and tell. Just think about it. You're gonna go there and work and inhale all that every day, even with the mask on your face. Who knows what kind of mask they were using. Corbett doesn't cover that. But what kind of mask do those people have on? Are they N95 or are they like the regular masks that they were handing out during COVID? I'm not sure. Perhaps I'll go look for that if I update this video in some fashion. But who looks at all that stuff in the air and says it's safe? It was like that for weeks and months afterwards, where there was like a cloud in the air. And it's safe to work in? Okay, you know, whatever. But I don't believe it.
The whole top came off. The whole top came off. And then the smoke, all of a sudden I see the smoke follow. I was standing next to the lieutenant, and I couldn't. All of a sudden I couldn't see him. We were under the truck. The top came off.
I'm taking everything to death issue.
And the fire door on 76 was locked.
Get some water. Well, I don't have any. Just fucking. I'll get some water. Go under the fire truck. Right there's the closest fire truck has water right there. You have no water?
You got water?
If you can find any asbestos, I can get you water. There's a truck right there. Right there.
Beginning shortly after the attack, and continuing for years afterward, Dr. Jenkins attempted to bring the EPA's faulty and fraudulent air quality testing practices to the attention of anyone who would listen. According to the Administrative Review Board of the U.S. Department of Labor, beginning in 2001, Jenkins made numerous disclosures and complaints alleging that the EPA engaged in improper laboratory testing, falsified a regulation governing exposure safety standards, and knowingly covered up the toxic properties of the dust emanating from the September 11, 2001 World Trade Center disaster. The improper testing and cover-up, Jenkins claimed, contributed to excessive and harmful toxic dust exposure of WTC first responders and others, sufficient to later cause respiratory and other serious and debilitating disease.
Once again, you have to figure if they'll lie and put so many people's lives in danger, and the men and women who have families at home who are relying on the EPA to just do their job and not lie to people, then they failed miserably. They failed. And perhaps, I like to think that at least a little bit of me says, well, maybe they lied so people would want to come to the World Trade Center and work there and clear out all that debris. Because if you know you're going to die in the process of cleaning that up, are you going to go? Who's going to go do that when you know your life is on the line? I don't know. But that's besides the point. They should tell people the truth. And you can make up your own mind about whether you're going to put your life on the line. And then, shouldn't you be given a decent sum of money or given to your family and good health care so you can live out the rest of your days in a decent fashion with good health care and money to take care of your family? But no, it doesn't look like they wanted to do that. They just didn't care about the lives of the people who cleaned up after the so-called attacks on September 11th, 2001.
Jenkins disseminated these disclosures and complaints to her supervisors and others at EPA, to the EPA Inspector General's office, members of Congress, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as to state officials, state-elected representatives, law firms representing WTC first responders, citizens, and the media. Her disclosures were posted on websites and repeatedly quoted in the press and television broadcasts and by members of Congress. One of these early memos, dated January 11, 2002, was written on EPA letterhead and addressed to affected parties and responsible officials. It examines the case of Libby, Montana, a designated Superfund site where the federal government is paying to help residents clean the interiors of homes and residential soils that have been contaminated with asbestos from an adjacent vermiculite mining operation. Jenkins compared the level of contaminated dust particles found inside apartments in Lower Manhattan after 9/11 to dust samples taken in Libby, finding that the New York samples contained 22 times higher concentrations of asbestos than the Montana samples.
One day I will get off into the book Foundations, Their Power and Influence. Some of that revolves around science and the scientific method. I don't believe that most government organizations are really involved in the scientific method in 2024. I also am bringing that up so I can talk about how Cate Jenkins said that the samples that they took in Libby compared to the samples that they took around the World Trade Center were 23 times as bad as what was happening in Libby. Meaning Libby had their own problems. And she's saying it's 23 times as bad as what happened around 9/11 and the World Trade Center. She, again, is wanting people to know where our government goes wrong. But our government doesn't really want to do that for us. Because she's an individual. She's an individual who, it looks like, cared and wanted people to know the truth. We can't expect that from our government as a group. We just can't.
As Jenkins noted, the logical question thus arises: why is EPA leaving people to their own devices in the cleanup of New York City while intervening to clean homes at taxpayer expense in Libby? Worse, a team of independent scientists hired by tenant groups and New York political leaders found much higher samples of asbestos in the dust than what the EPA was reporting. As Dr. Jenkins told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch at the time, for every asbestos fiber EPA detected, the new methods used by the outside experts found 9. This is too important a difference to be ignored if you really care about the health of the public.
That's because, it's like I already said, we don't want to trust government organizations 100%. You just don't. Get information from outside sources and compare the two. Because oftentimes, if they're different, then that means we have more homework to do. Especially if there's a great gap in between what the government says the problem is and what an independent organization says the problem is. Because they're both going to tell you that it's based upon science. But then we have to break the science down and see exactly what we're being told. And we can come up with answers. We can. We have to be more dependent upon ourselves and our own thinking and stop listening to the government every chance they tell us something.
New York City directly lied about the test results for asbestos in air. When they finally released them, they doctored the results. They changed high hazardous levels to 0 when they finally released them.
After years of internal memos, press interviews, and other tireless efforts to blow the whistle on the severe health issues that would develop as a result of the EPA's deliberate cover-up, the mainstream media was finally forced to begin covering the issue in 2006, after many of the Ground Zero cleanup workers and the residents of Manhattan were beginning to succumb to the effects of the deadly dust. In 2006, after a federal judge ruled that Whitman's post-9/11 lies were conscience-shocking and that she would not be granted immunity for her actions, the media finally began to cover the story. The New York Times, CBS, and other outlets all ran stories on the scandal, and they all quoted from Jenkins' memos and featured interviews with Jenkins herself. After the 5th anniversary came and went on September 11, 2006, however, the media's attention turned elsewhere, and the story drifted out of the attention of the public once again. But Dr. Jenkins' attempt to obtain justice for the victims of this horrendous crime did not end there. In 2007, she penned a remarkable 134-page letter addressed to then-Senator Hillary Clinton, as well as Congressman Gerald Nadler and Carolyn Maloney, calling for a Senate investigation of the falsification of pH corrosivity data for World Trade Center dust. The thoroughly documented letter, containing over 300 footnotes and citations, included a detailed analysis of the falsification of WTC pH data by groups like U.S. Geological Survey, and the remarkable story of how, in May 1980, EPA's hazardous waste program falsified pH levels, changed the numbers, that the UN World Health Organization, International Labour Organization, determined would invariably result in corrosive permanent tissue damage, chemical burns. In a much shorter, though no less explosive, letter to the Federal Bureau of Investigation written at the same time, Jenkins also called for the FBI to open a criminal investigation into the EPA's cover-up. This was followed up with an additional letter to the FBI in 2008, where Jenkins went even further, alleging fraud in pH testing of WTC dust and providing documentation that the EPA lab had diluted WTC dust almost 600 times with water before testing it for corrosivity. Remarkably, despite her very public and very serious charges against the federal agency, and despite her past experience blowing the whistle on the EPA and subsequent years-long court battle to retain her position, Jenkins told Occupational Hazards magazine in 2002 that she did not fear losing her job over her comments. All EPA management has to do is say stop, and they haven't, she said, adding that as an EPA official, speaking out about lapses in the agency's WTC effort does not require courage, just plenty of hard work. Despite this belief, Dr. Jenkins was indeed fired from the EPA on December 30th, 2010. The firing followed a series of inane workplace incidents that resulted in suspensions and other retaliatory measures against Jenkins. The chain of events included Jenkins sending an email under the title, Op-Ed, Should EPA Institute a Workplace Fragrance Ban as part of its Endocrine Disruptor Initiative? After an encounter with a heavily perfumed IT tech triggered an asthma attack in Jenkins, and her supervisor recommending that she be suspended as the email, which was only sent to other EPA staff, could have misled recipients as to whether it was an official EPA communication. Eventually, the supervisor claimed that the series of incidents culminated with Jenkins threatening him in a workplace incident that was witnessed by no one. As the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, who supported Jenkins in her ordeal with the agency, summarized, Dr. Cate Jenkins, a senior chemist with more than 3 decades of agency tenure, publicly charged that due to falsified EPA standards, first responders waded into dust so corrosive that it caused chemical burns deep within their respiratory systems. After raising the issue to the EPA Inspector General, Congress, and the FBI, Dr. Jenkins was isolated, harassed, and ultimately removed from her position on December 30th, 2010 by EPA, based upon an unwitnessed and contested claim that the soft-spoken petite childhood polio survivor threatened her 6-foot male supervisor. Continuing through a series of appeals, legal wrangling, and bureaucratic red tape, Jenkins succeeded in having her employment reinstated in 2012.
A government whistleblower who was fired after exposing the dangers of asbestos and dust on workers at Ground Zero in the days after 9/11 has been reinstated to her job following a federal court decision. Cate Jenkins, a chemist who worked for the Environmental Protection Agency, was the first EPA official to warn that dust in the air around the World Trade Center could pose a serious health risk. But the head of the EPA at the time claimed there was no reason for concern. Jenkins accused the EPA of intentionally hiding the dangers of air pollution at Ground Zero. She was fired in 2010. A federal court has now ruled Jenkins must be reinstated and given back pay.
Incredibly, even this was not the end of Jenkins' ordeal. Instead of returning her to her daily work duties in 2012 as ordered, the EPA instead kept Jenkins on paid administrative leave and then refiled the same charges against her in 2013. Less than a year after being ordered to give her her job back, the agency was instead trying to take it away again, saying that Jenkins had failed to prove that the EPA was retaliating for her whistleblowing. The agency's move was especially galling, given that Jenkins had yet to be given a chance to prove her case. Part of the reason that the EPA had been ordered to restore Jenkins to her job was because the agency had been found to have destroyed records pertaining to her case and otherwise obstructed discovery. In fact, her case that the EPA had retaliated against her for her whistleblowing was still before the Department of Labor. The entire legal ordeal proceeded for years, finally coming to an end in 2018, a full 8 years after the agency's first attempt to fire her, when the Department of Labor confirmed a 2015 decision that the EPA had retaliated against Jenkins for her report to Congress and the FBI, and to the public through the media, about her allegations of violation of environmental laws and regulations by the EPA in connection with the rescue and cleanup operations at the World Trade Center, in violation of the whistleblower provisions of the Clean Air Act, the Solid Waste Disposal Act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act, and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act.
Our government oftentimes has laws and acts in place to protect citizens. But if we don't know what those laws and acts are, then we can't protect ourselves and we can't hold these agencies accountable for when they harm first responders, the people who live in communities where tragedies happen, whether they be natural or man-made, but people ignore the laws that are already on the books. And that's what happened here. There are already laws and acts in place to protect citizens. But the government, oftentimes, though they make the laws, they don't uphold them. So it's up to us as citizens to hold people accountable when they break the law. If we don't do it, don't expect our government to do it either.
After nearly 2 decades of research and whistleblowing and almost 10 years of legal nightmare, Jenkins was finally vindicated. She had been unjustly fired for attempting to call attention to the agency's wrongdoing, and she was restored to her position. But although this victory is to be celebrated, it comes as slim comfort for those seeking justice for the victims of 9/11. Not just those killed in the buildings that day, and not just the victims of the wars that have been waged in the name of September 11th, but the victims of the toxic dust that Cate Jenkins and others had been warning about since the events unfolded. And meanwhile, those who pushed the deadly lies about the air quality have moved on with their lives, continuing their careers and only occasionally being confronted by the independent media that is still attempting to shed light on the story.
Hey, Ms. Whitman, I appreciate your talk in there. You guys mentioned voting and the power of shaming voters. I feel like there's probably a lot of folks who feel like you might need to be shamed since it's been 17 years since 9/11 and nearly 10,000 people are now sick with 9/11 related illnesses. And I know you apologized about it for 2 years ago and you were cleared in the courts, but all evidence points to your time in the Bush administration clearly led to people being sick.
Take a picture for me.
Led to people being, getting to cancer and other 9/11 related illnesses.
I said everything that I said was based on the best available science at the time.
In my earlier videos about the tyranny of experts, I showed an article that reinforces what this lady just said. She said everything that they told people about the World Trade Center and whether it was going to be hazardous to your health or not was based upon the best science at the time. That is a lie, because for the people who said it's poisonous now and it will be in the future, they were correct. This lady was wrong, and that's why the man interviewing her was like, yo, what's up? How come people aren't being held responsible, paraphrasing what he said, for what happened to the first responders and the people living around the World Trade Center? Because they don't want to hold people accountable, and they let you know through their actions. This lady said everything I said was based upon the best available science at the time. That's a scapegoat, because other people were saying the exact opposite. As in Cate Jenkins, who said this place is poisonous. And it's way more poisonous than the people who were dealing with their soil being contaminated in Libya. They mentioned that in this video. Watch it over again if need be. But as far as I'm concerned, this will probably be the last time I chime in on this video. So I'll see you next time. And I'm going to include the last minute or two of the video. Thanks for watching.
That we didn't know them, but I never said anything that wasn't predicated on what the scientists told me that morning. Every morning I had a conference call with the scientists and what is safe to say, what can I say, what shouldn't I say? And they kept repeating that they were seeing nothing in their studies that showed that there was a long-term health consequence from the air in Manhattan in general, in lower Manhattan in general.